This looks good, I think. Let me see.
My work is easy because I use ClickUp.
Perfect. Wow. What a wonderful evening, my friends. Welcome back to Microsoft Excel Power Platform Meetup for Saudi Arabia. And today is the first day of Ramzan. So I would like to wish everyone Ramzan Mubarak. And thank you, Anna, my friend, one of my friends who is sitting on the hot seat in Toronto on the other side. I wish she would come someday in Saudi Arabia and she would come and speak over here when we have an event. But she's a data security consultant, stayed in Toronto, and mashallah, she's also an MVP. And that's how I come to know Anna through LinkedIn, and then I see her work, and then I requested her to come and speak about, something about data security, which is very unique topic going to take place in today's meetup, because we have been always learning about Excel, Power BI, but today's content is little different, where Anna will be diving us into seeing how the data security is important and what can we take care about data, because it's data is next oil, as it is said rightly. So I will leave the floor to Anna because she has a lot of stuff to say. And Anna, over to you. Thank you so much for coming in Saudi Arabia meetup. And please, the stage is all yours. And please introduce yourself. And we are really eager
Sure.
to hear about what is the data security you have as for us today.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the intro, Faraz, and for the invitation to join. Super excited to bring my favorite topic to the table here today, data security. Yeah, so as Faraz mentioned, I am Anna. I'm based in Toronto, so probably much colder than where most of you all are. So I'm a data security consultant at Protiviti, which means that every day with our clients, I'm working to define data security strategies, but also implement them. And not just with the administrators, but I also do a lot of work with the end users to make sure that what we're doing from an admin perspective is not hurting their productivity. So you'll see throughout today's session, I could go deep on the admin side, but I'm assuming that most of you are Excel and Power BI power users. So I've really tailored this session to be more end user focused and to help you productively and securely work in Excel and Power BI. So a couple more things about me. So yes, as Faraz mentioned, I am a Microsoft MVP in the Purview space. I am a very recently, as in I believe it's 3, 4 weeks now, awarded the Security Changemaker of the Year by the Microsoft Intelligent Security Association. And I am also the co-founder of the International Data Security User Group. So we have a monthly meetup where we bring in speakers from either the MVP community, the Microsoft community, or just in general, people who are passionate about data security to speak about various data security topics. So if that's something that interests you, you can see that I have that QR code there. There's a link to the International Data Security User Group, but there's also a link to my LinkedIn. So feel free to connect if you have any questions. There's also a link to my blog there, which is where I post a lot of the insights that I get from working with our clients and seeing really in the real world what works from a data security perspective and what may not work so well. So all of those insights you can find by scanning that QR code. So no worries if you didn't have time on the slide. I'll also have that up at the end of the session. Okay, so that's a little bit about me, a little bit about today's session. So we are going to start off by just discussing high level, why is it important to protect your data? This is a topic I can speak about for a very long time, but I will try to just keep it short, convince you all that it's extremely important to go ahead and protect your data. Then we're going to get into actually how you can protect your data. There's many different ways organizations go about protecting their data. Some of them you'll see the impact of, others you won't. So we'll go over a high level of how organizations do this, and then we'll focus in on one specific avenue or control that organizations use very commonly to establish that baseline level of data security within their data estate. So a little spoiler alert, that's sensitivity labels that we're going to be focusing on. So the point 3 there is really going over the impacts of labeling. So my goal for today's session is to help you all walk away with an understanding of why data protection is important. And I also want to help you feel empowered to protect your data without affecting your productivity. So with that being said, let's get into the first topic, why protect your data? $4.4 million US dollars. I will leave it on the screen for a second. Anybody has any ideas what that number might mean? If you are
I wish it is from my bank account.
Me too. Let me tell you, me too. But unfortunately not. Unfortunately, this is the global average cost of a single data breach, and that's according to a report from IBM. So that's definitely not a trivial amount of money for any organization to pay as a result of a data breach. Let's put up another number. I think this would be a good number too to have in my bank account. But unfortunately, that's also not the case. So this here is the PCI DSS, so the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard fine for significant data breaches. So on top of the cost of a data breach of 4.4 million USD, it can also be fined from like a legal and regulatory perspective as well for data breaches. So hopefully that showed you that protecting your data is important. To summarize, data breaches have many different significant negative impacts. Like we saw, there is a significant financial impact for data breaches. You also have legal exposure. So on top of just fines, you can actually have serious legal repercussions. In extreme cases, you'll even see criminal charges for data breaches. We also have damage to reputation. So breaches of data can lead your customers to not trust that you're securely managing their data, and so that can damage your reputation. It can expose sensitive information that the public shouldn't see, and all of the above. That can result in a loss of business, and of course, leading to unintended leaks of sensitive data. That's really never a good position to be in. So it's very important to protect your data. And most importantly, everyone plays a role in data protection. This is not just the administrators that have to worry about protecting data. They set up the environment to protect your data, but end users have a significant impact on the effectiveness of the data protection controls that the administrators put in place. So with all that being said, hopefully I've convinced you protecting your data is important. Now let's talk about how corporate data is protected. At a high level, the first and kind of baseline foundational control that organizations put in place to protect their data is sensitivity labels. And sensitivity labels allow organizations to classify data based on the level of sensitivity of that data. As it sounds, sensitivity labels. They allow you to control access to sensitive information with things like encryption and access controls. They also allow the enforcement of data protection policies across your different devices and applications. They prevent or can help to prevent unauthorized sharing and leakage of sensitive data. And all in all, this can help to enhance your compliance with regulatory requirements. So sensitivity labels are really a foundational control. Next, we have data loss prevention. So data loss prevention at a high level, it helps to monitor and control the flow of data across your organization. So it can do things like block unauthorized sharing of sensitive data. Maybe, let's say, credit card numbers or social security numbers shouldn't be shared externally via email, let's say. Like, this is just a policy that your organization sets up. So you can automatically block that unauthorized sharing. Data loss prevention can also help to alert your administrators to potential data breaches or policy violations. So it can block, it can alert, it can help administrators monitor your data flows, and it can also prevent accidental exposure of confidential information through email or various cloud services. So that's a key component of the corporate data protection strategy. The final key component are tenant controls. So this is something that, as an end user, you're not going to configure, but you may see the impacts of high-level tenant controls being applied. So just to give some examples, you can restrict or limit external sharing in your tenant. You can implement conditional access. So based on certain user attributes or location attributes, you can say that a user has access or does not have access to certain data. You can require multi-factor authentication for accessing particularly sensitive corporate data. You can set expiration dates on shared links. That's to help limit long-term access. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with tenant controls. This applies, as it sounds, across your entire corporate tenant, and they are very powerful. But for the purposes of this session, we are going to focus on sensitivity labels. The reason being, as I mentioned, labeling is really the baseline of every effective data protection implementation. Without labeling, you can't create data loss prevention policies that are tailored to the sensitivity of the data. Labeling helps you, as I mentioned, to make sure that your admins know what type of data is out there, protect it accordingly. So sensitivity labels they're very important. And as the end user, you are likely going to interact with sensitivity labels quite a bit. And I'll show you in which ways that you'll see the impacts of labeling throughout the session. So going forward, we will dig into what sensitivity labels are, how they can be applied, and what are the impacts once they are applied that you will see as the end user. So what is a sensitivity label? We kind of went over this in the previous couple of slides, but just to summarize, sensitivity labels help you to label data based on its level of sensitivity. You can apply sensitivity labels at a file and email level. So you can label your files, you can label your emails. You can also label SharePoint sites, but that is a whole different beast of controls that you can apply. So for the purposes of this session, that will be out of scope. We are going to focus on sensitivity labels applied to files specifically. And labeling supports and implements protection of data that is tailored to the sensitivity level. This is important because that way we can help to balance security controls, but also the productivity. So we're not applying restrictive controls to every type of data. We're only applying it to the most sensitive type of data. So on the screen here, you'll see a very common sensitivity label schema that I tend to come across when I'm working with organizations. The naming can be different, but the point really is that public here is the least sensitive type of data that an organization can have. It's approved for public sharing. If there is external sharing, that is actually an approved use case. We then go to internal. So this is data that should be kept internal, but it's not particularly sensitive. Like, it may not have, just as an example, customer data or personally identifiable information, but it still has some details on business plans or just notes from meetings that may include sensitive information. So then we have the internal. And that is actually typically the most common type of data that we see. Then we have confidential and restricted. So restricted is that most sensitive type of data. That can be maybe, let's say, data that, or a file that has full names along with social insurance numbers or social security numbers, some credit card data with customer names, data that can really be tied to the person. And if it is shared externally or internally with the wrong person, there can be a significant negative impact on your business. So high level, public, least sensitive, going to restricted, most sensitive data. Again, this is just an example. Throughout the rest of the session, I will be using this labeling schema. You can have more labels, less labels. You can have sub-labels, but we won't get into all of the details here. We'll just keep it simple with these 4 sensitivity labels. So again, this helps you to comply with corporate and regulatory demands, and labels can have different impacts on users. So you'll see in the following slides the impacts, but high level, you have content marking, so you can actually see the fact that this label was applied. And labels can also enforce encryption settings, which affects user access in intended ways. So we'll get into all of those impacts in just a bit. Okay, so now that we know in a little more detail what a sensitivity label is, we'll talk about the different ways that sensitivity labels are actually applied to data. The first one is manual. So think of yourself as the end user, really being hands-on with the sensitivity labels, kind of like the mechanic in the picture here. So as the end user, you are the one choosing which sensitivity label is applied and when it's applied. We also have automatic labeling. So in this case, kind of works like magic. Although it isn't magic, it's a simple condition that the administrators set up in the back end. So the system will either recommend or automatically apply a sensitivity label for you. And I'll show this in a demo in just a bit. But then we also have default labeling. So this is a label that is applied to, let's say, all files by default. In the label schema that I showed in the last slide, internal is often the default that we set because this is the most common data that your users work with. So something to note is that these 3 ways of applying sensitivity labels, they work together. And it's important to know that manual label application, so when a user goes in and actually selects which sensitivity label should apply, will always take precedence over automatic and default labeling. So the system will not be able to overwrite your manual edits, and the default label also will not be able to overwrite them. And that's intended because, as the user, you have the ability to have the entire context of the document and accurately select the correct sensitivity label. So we want the manual to overwrite the automatic and the default. Okay, so that is the different way that we can apply sensitivity labels. Now let's see it in action. So this first one here, we'll start with Microsoft Excel. And it's a very similar experience on the web and in the desktop for this particular one. So I think this one I just did from the web. But essentially here what we're showing is manual label application. So that is user driven. You as the user are going into the document, clicking on the sensitivity button and selecting the sensitivity label. This one here is built in, so you're doing it within the Office application itself. And I'll show you very quickly in this video what that looks like. You just select the sensitivity dropdown and you select the label that should apply. After a couple of seconds, you see that the internal label that you selected is the sensitivity label that's applied to the Excel document. So nothing really riveting here. This is just how you manually apply a label in Excel. Okay, there's also another way for users to manually apply sensitivity labels. Again, this is user-driven because it's manual. The only difference is that it's not built in. This is done with the help of what's called the Microsoft Purview Information Protection Client. And this client is distributed to your devices oftentimes by your administrators. So if you're seeing that maybe on your device, you can't really apply the sensitivity label this way, likely it's because you just don't have the client deployed. Most organizations I work with do have this deployed, so they are able to do this. The benefit of this type of client deployment is that, first of all, you don't have to go into the document to apply a sensitivity label, but the biggest benefit is that it extends the document types that can be labeled. So with built-in labeling, you're looking at your built-in Office applications. So PowerPoint, Excel, and Word. Those are really the target document types for labeling with built-in. That's what we saw in the previous slide. With the client deployed, you can extend it to, let's say, PDF files, image files, CSVs. So it really helps to make sure that your entire data estate is labeled. And the way that the user experience works is you right-click on a document from the File Explorer, click on Show More Options, click on Apply Sensitivity Label with Microsoft Purview, and then you go ahead and select the sensitivity label. You can see the experience is slightly different from the built-in, but the process is really the same. You're manually selecting a sensitivity label. So once you click Close, the sensitivity label is applied and the data will be protected. Okay, so those were the two ways to manually apply sensitivity labels. Now we'll look at the automatic application of sensitivity labels. And there's really three types of auto labeling, is what we call it. The first one is when the system recommends a label for you to apply. So it's system driven. It's looking at the content of the document and looking for certain conditions to be met. Once those conditions are met, it will recommend that you apply a label. But at the end of the day, you as the user still have the final say as to whether that sensitivity label that's recommended is applied or not. So it's system driven, but user involved. And it is built in. So you do have to actually open the Excel document in order to see this prompt and be able to accept or reject the recommendation. So we'll see this in the example here. In my environment that I've used to show all of these scenarios, I have set up the fact that if I see a credit card number along with the actual word credit card number in an Excel file, then it will recommend that I apply the confidential label. So this is what we're going to see happen. I paste a credit card number, I have the actual text there, I get a policy tip. So right now it's general, right? But I do get a policy tip that confidential should be applied instead of general. I accept it, and then the confidential label is applied. So it really helps to make sure that as the user, you are aware of any sensitive information that might be in your Excel file, and then you label the document accordingly. Okay, so that was recommend a label functionality. Now we're going to look at the actual automatic label application. So this is when the system, again, looks at the document, looks for certain conditions to be met, but instead of prompting you or asking you if you'd like to accept this recommendation, it simply directly applies the label to the document. Again, as the end user, you can always manually change the sensitivity label if the automatic label wasn't accurate. That's always a capability that you have. But this auto labeling really does help with labeling accuracy, because if the conditions that the admin set up are fairly accurate, you can get some good upgrades of sensitivity labels being applied. Yeah, so this one again is done within the Excel file itself, so you do have to open it up, but I'll show you how it looks and feels. Again, it's system driven. So you can see we start with an internal document. Then I paste a full name along with a social insurance number, and I'm waiting a little bit for this to apply. I do get a message that the label was applied as restricted because I pasted the full name and the social insurance number, and then I can just tap or click on the name of the document, and I can truly see that the restricted sensitivity label was applied. So in this way, as you're working with your Excel files, and you may start off with a file that doesn't have sensitive information in it, but as you're working with it, maybe a credit card number finds its way in, or as in this example, a full name with a social insurance number is now in this document. The system will help you to evolve the sensitivity label that's applied according to the sensitivity of the document itself. So it helps with labeling accuracy, and labeling accuracy is really key to effectively protecting your data. One thing that I didn't mention, so we went over 2 of the ways of automatically applying sensitivity labels. There is a third way, but the third way, honestly, the demo isn't so thrilling because it's done without any user involvement. The user can't really see it working. It's what I'm referring to is service-side auto labeling. And essentially, it's the service, the Microsoft Purview Information Protection Service, running in the background and applying labels to your documents depending on certain conditions being met. So the principle is the same. It's going to happen to data at rest in the back end without the user really seeing it happen. The only impact will be that once the user actually opens this document, the sensitivity label is going to be updated according to what was automatically applied. So those are the 3 ways that we can auto-label in Excel. Just to summarize though, there are other ways to automatically apply labels, and I wanted to put this all on one slide so you can see this top to bottom. This is what you as the end user, some behavior that you are likely seeing if you have sensitivity labels deployed in your org. So the first one is default labeling. Your administrators can set a default label for all of the files in your organization. They can also set a different default label for files created or updated in specific SharePoint document libraries. Let's say you have a document library with legal contracts. So the default label will likely have to be confidential or restricted instead of internal. It's those types of use cases that this capability is used for. So other than the default label, we can also, as you have seen, recommend a label for users to apply. We can also automatically apply a label upon the user going into the document, creating a document or updating a document. But then we can also automatically label data at rest in OneDrive and SharePoint. So that's a good summary, I think, of the auto label capabilities. Again, other than the auto label and the default label, we also have always the manual labeling available to your users. So that's it for Excel. Now let's shift to Power BI. And the way that we apply sensitivity labels is different in the Power BI service versus Power BI desktop. And I'll show you that in just a second. Let's start off with the Power BI service. So again, we're focusing first on manual label applications. So this is user-driven, and specifically for reports and dashboards, all you have to do is select those 3 dots, go into your settings, scroll down to sensitivity label, and then you'll have a drop-down with the different sensitivity labels that you have deployed to you within your organization. You select whichever sensitivity label you'd like to select, and you click on Save. So that is it's a simple process. That's pretty much it. You just manually select your sensitivity label. It's very similar in the Power BI service for manually applying sensitivity labels to semantic models and data flows. So you simply go ahead, select the 3 dots, go into your settings. Under sensitivity label, you'll have a drop-down with the different labels that you have available for you, and then you'll click Apply. So honestly, the biggest difference is the button saying Apply instead of Save, but it is very much a similar process for manual label application. to semantic models and data flows, just as we saw for reports and dashboards on this slide. So fairly simple over here. Okay, so that was manual application in the Power BI service. Now let's shift our focus to Power BI desktop. So again, we're looking at manual application for now. This is user-driven, and the way that we label PBIX files is very similar to what we saw in Excel, where we have a sensitivity dropdown, and then we can go ahead and select the label that applies. So let me just play this demo for you. So very simple, just select the dropdown of sensitivity, select the label that applies, and then it's a little small, so I'll zoom in here. You can see actually that the sensitivity label that was applied manually is showing over here at the bottom. So that's actually a good way to check if your PBX file is currently labeled or not. Do you see the sensitivity label applied here or not? So that's just a fun tip. Okay, so manual labeling, again, fairly simple process, both in the Power BI service as well as in Power BI desktop. Okay, so we've seen that video. All right, now shifting our focus to automatically applied labels in Power BI. Now, auto labeling in Power BI it's a different concept than auto labeling in Excel. In Excel, as an administrator, you would set up a certain condition for data within your Excel file that matches to confidential or restricted. So what we saw was that the administrator said credit card numbers equals confidential, the full name with the social insurance number equals restricted, just as an example. On the other hand, automatically applying labels in Power BI is different because we don't set up those conditions per se. It's a different concept because auto labeling in Power BI really happens upon export, upload, or creation of new reports, dashboards, etc. So I'll go over all of the different use cases that you can have where labels are automatically applied to your content, but it tends to happen based on existing labels applied. And you'll see what I mean by this in just a second. So the first scenario or use case that I'd like to focus our attention on is when we upload from Power BI desktop into the Power BI service, or we publish essentially. So in this case, let's say that we had a sensitivity label applied in Power BI desktop. We manually selected the label as you just saw me do. So the label that's applied in Power BI desktop will automatically be applied to the semantic model and the report in the Power BI service. So in the case where we have existing labels applied to the semantic model, it can get quite complex if it's not just like a simple first time publish. The label that is applied in Power BI desktop will overwrite existing labels. So that's the first case where we're publishing, and the report and semantic model get that label automatically applied. The second use case or scenario here is when we are exporting from the Power BI service into Power BI desktop. So really just the reverse of use case one. In this case, the most restrictive sensitivity label that is applied to the semantic model and the report in the service will be applied to the resulting PBIX file. So let's say in some case we have a semantic model that might have the confidential sensitivity label applied and the report has internal. We export that into Power BI desktop, so the resulting PBIX file will have the confidential label applied. In simple cases where the semantic model and report have the same sensitivity label applied, and honestly, most of the times that is the case, I find, then simply the sensitivity label is inherited by that PBIX file. So it's automatically applied there as well. Okay, so we looked at publishing, we looked at exporting. The next instance of auto labeling in Power BI is through sensitivity label inheritance of newly created content. So newly created content in Power BI, in the Power BI service specifically, will inherit the sensitivity label that's applied to a parent semantic model or report, if it is labeled, right? So if it's not labeled, no label will be applied. You can always manually apply a sensitivity label, as we saw. But in the case where the parent semantic model or report are labeled, it will inherit that label automatically. Also, newly created content from labeled data sources will inherit the sensitivity label. So what does that mean? Let's say we have an Excel file stored in SharePoint, and we have the confidential sensitivity label applied to that Excel file. When we create content and reference that as the data source, then the confidential label will be inherited by the resulting content. If you're referencing multiple data sources with different sensitivity labels, then it's useful to remember that the most restrictive sensitivity label is the one that's going to be inherited. So that, I would say, is actually a good principle to keep in mind across all of these use cases, is that more restrictive takes precedence over less restrictive, which makes sense because we want to protect the data according to what is most sensitive. Okay, there is a small note there, and I'll zoom in for a second. So when we are referencing or creating content from data sources, currently there's only 3 cases that are supported for inheriting the sensitivity label, namely if you're referencing Excel in OneDrive and SharePoint Online, Azure Synapse Analytics, and Azure SQL Database. So if you're seeing that you're referencing data sources, but the sensitivity label isn't being inherited, it could be the case that it's just not supported way of doing it so far. Okay, so those are really the 3 most complicated use cases. The 4th one I'd like to bring up for automatically applying labels in Power BI is the default label, specifically in Power BI Desktop. So similar to Excel files, we can specify a default label. However, this will only work in Power BI Desktop. There is no default labeling supported as of yet in Power BI Service. And finally, from an administrator perspective, they can use REST APIs for programmatically labeling content. As an end user, you're likely not going to go about this route, but in case we have any administrators on the call today, then that is something that is available to you. Okay, so I think that was a very heavy slide. Just to summarize what we've covered so far. We've covered how can you apply sensitivity labels in Excel. We saw manual application, automatic application, and default labeling. We've also covered the same in Power BI. The difference was manual labeling was very similar, but automatic labeling, as we see here, is not done based on conditions on the content. It's really done upon exporting, publishing, and inheriting sensitivity labels. So next, there are more caveats coming. So specifically for the sensitivity label inheritance on the export from the Power BI service. So that was the second use case that we went over. There are only certain export paths that are supported for sensitivity label inheritance. Namely, we have Excel, PDF, and PowerPoint, Analyze in Excel, pivot table in Excel with a live connection, and a download to a BBIX file. For the PowerPoint option, there is also another caveat where currently only the export as image option is supported. So these are things that are important to keep in mind, important to know, because if you're seeing that you're exporting data but it may be failing or the resulting data is not labeled, then this is likely why. There's only specific export paths that are currently supported. And I've also included a link there so you can see some documentation later on that explains this in a lot more detail. Okay, so that is applying labels. Now let's shift our focus into point 3 of our agenda. What are the impacts of labeling your files? So we'll start off again with Excel. And the first thing I'd like to bring up is the fact that when you do apply a label, and again, it depends on how your administrators set it up, but oftentimes we do see this actually implemented within organizations. So when you do apply a label, there is the possibility that automatically a header, footer, or watermark will be applied. Or you can have all three, which honestly is quite rare. We typically see a header or a footer being applied to content. So what this looks like in Excel is we have that confidential label applied, and then we can see that automatically we have a confidential footer applied to our Excel file. This is super helpful because, since watching this session, you know that clicking on the name of the Excel file will show you the sensitivity label that's applied, but not all users might be so aware of that. So when we do have a footer applied, your end users are more aware of the fact that this file is confidential, and so they know to treat it with greater care than a file that may be internal or public. Okay, so that was the first one, and for reference, this is what we call content markings. Okay, then the second labeling impact. This is another one of those caveats that we see. So you don't need to necessarily know what user-defined permissions means, but essentially it's labels that encrypt content, and upon encrypting, it asks the user which users or groups should be given access to the file. And the caveat here is if you do have a label that is user-defined permissions, that label must be applied in the desktop Office applications. Now, I have seen on the roadmap that that should be supported for application in the web versions of Excel around mid-February. I tested it recently and still haven't seen it come out, so very much looking forward to that capability coming out. I think that'd be great from a usability perspective. But for now, what you'll see is we have a file in the web, and I'll select the sensitivity of restricted custom permissions. Let me just pause that here. So I select a UDP label, as we call it, and then you'll get a pop-up saying that there's a problem with the sensitivity. The label selected is unavailable in Office on the web. To apply the label, open the file in Office desktop. So it is, I think, pretty explanatory as to what's going on. All you have to do is select Open in Desktop App. And you wait for it to open. Here I'm bringing it from my other screen. Okay, so now we have it open in the desktop. We select the label that should be applied. That's the UDP label specifically. And then there we go. Not that this is really the focus of this example here, but you can see that this is where the user kind of defines which users or groups have access to this document. So it successfully showed this menu. You can click apply after you grant your users or groups access. And then going up to the sensitivity label, we successfully applied the restricted custom permissions label. So essentially, you can't do it in the web, not as of yet. Hopefully that's coming soon. But you are kind of redirected to the desktop Office app to apply certain labels with specific encryption settings. So if you do see that error message, do not be worried. All you have to do is apply it in the desktop version. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention here is that after you do apply it in the desktop version, you can open and work with these documents in the web as well. So it's literally just the application of the label that is restricted to desktop. Okay, so next, labeling impact in Excel. Label permissions take precedence. Let's say you have a SharePoint site, you grant a user access to a file. In this case, in my dev tenant, I am granting access to Diego, and Diego receives an email saying that they have been invited to a file. He goes ahead and selects open, but upon opening, he'll notice that he doesn't actually have permissions. And I will pause this here to zoom in and show you the error message. It will say this document is protected by a rights management service, such as Azure Information Protection. So as an end user, you can simply just copy paste this message and send it off to your support team for help if need be. But it is useful, I would say, to be aware of the fact that this specific error message is actually showing you that the label that was applied has encryption settings that restrict the user from accessing the content. And the encryption settings will always take precedence over the access rights that you grant in SharePoint. So that is important to note. If a user doesn't have access based on the encryption settings, they will not be able to access the document, which helps us to protect that data. Now, before we play that video, so here we are. The next thing is that, again, label permissions take precedence, but it's not always about granting or restricting access to the document itself. Sometimes it's just restricting specific activities. So in this example here, again, I have granted Diego edit access for a specific file in SharePoint. However, that file is labeled, and you'll see that a specific activity, specifically editing the document, is restricted for Diego. So in this view, I am Diego, I get a pop-up saying it's read-only, I do not have permissions to this file, I can't change the file name, things like that. And this is an intended action based on the sensitivity label applied. So let's say even if as an end user you accidentally share with edit permissions a file stored in SharePoint, the sensitivity label will continue to protect that document from unintended edits. All right, so those are labeling impacts. The final one, and I would say actually very relevant to today's world, is that in Excel, the label permissions, based on the sensitivity label applied, can actually protect or prevent Copilot from processing certain data. And this is very relevant for today's world. Sensitivity labels are being used by administrators to help protect their most sensitive content from Copilot referencing and usage. If you've ever heard of the problem of oversharing, this is a very effective control for that. And what it looks like in practice is I'm in Copilot chat. This also works in M365 Copilot, by the way. But I go ahead, I upload a file that has a sensitivity label that restricts access with encryption. And I simply ask Copilot chat to summarize the file for me. So I go ahead and do that. I give it to Copilot chat, it's thinking for a second, and then it provides me with an error message. So I'll zoom in here for you all. It essentially says, can't provide more information as access to this file was denied. Now, what's important to note is that it won't necessarily always say that it's the encryption settings of the file based on the sensitivity label that's restricting access. So it is important to know that specific sensitivity label settings could prevent Copilot from processing content. And this is often done intentionally by your administrators to protect your content from oversharing in Copilot. So we'll just let that video play till the end. It gives you some suggestions on what you can do and whatnot that you can try, but at the end of the day, the sensitivity label encryption will prevent Copilot from processing that content, thereby protecting your content from oversharing. Okay, so next one, labeling impacts in Power BI. Before we move on to this one, again, this will be a relatively heavy slide. Just want to summarize the labeling impacts in Excel. So we saw that encryption takes precedence over SharePoint access, OneDrive access as well. We saw that there is the caveat of applying certain labels in the desktop only version instead of Office. So these are things that they can change the user impact and whatnot, but it is useful as a user to know why this is happening. And likely it comes down to the fact that encryption of sensitivity labels is really the culprit, and it is intended to protect your data. And oh yeah, also we showed how content marking can help to highlight the sensitivity of the content, raise awareness of that sensitivity, and thereby make sure that your users are aware to be more careful with certain types of content, and maybe the fact that they can share public information publicly if you have that header, footer, or watermark there. Okay, so now let's get into labeling impacts in Power BI. And at a high level, you will see impacts into accessing, exporting, and publishing content. Your organization can mandate labels, and that has impacts into your Power BI workflows. And you can also see your sensitivity labels in different ways. So let's go step by step. We'll start off with impacts to accessing content. And we'll start off looking at the Power BI service. So in the Power BI service, sensitivity labels do not affect access to content. So access to content is managed solely by Power BI permissions, and encryption settings that may be configured as part of the labels will actually not be applied in the Power BI service. So to manage your access to content, rely on Power BI permissions in the Power BI service. In Power BI Desktop, sensitivity labels do affect your access to content. So encryption is applied, and users must have sufficient permissions to access and work with the file. So it's different depending on if you're using the Power BI service or Power BI Desktop. Next, users with a free license will not be able to open protected PBIX files. So free licensing will not work when you have a sensitivity label applied to content that applies encryption. The final point here for accessing is that users must have full control or export usage rights. This is something that you set up as part of the sensitivity label in order to open a protected PBIX files. So in the case where you do have the licensing, but you still can't open the PBIX file, you can reach out to the owner to ask them to grant you full control and or export usage rights, and then you will be able to access the content. Something to note also is that the owner of the file, so not the owner, but the user who sets the sensitivity label automatically gets full control. So you can reach out to that person to help them give you access to the file. All right, so that was accessing content. Next, we'll move on to exporting content. As you saw, there are certain paths for export that support inheriting sensitivity labels. In the case where you have mandatory labels, so your organization says every file needs to have a sensitivity label applied, in that case, you can actually see that export can fail if a label can't be applied. That's because, well, there's many different reasons why a label can't be applied, but the failing of the export is coming from that mandatory sensitivity label setting in your organization. So you'll oftentimes get different error messages, and you can dig into the error message. Again, your support team will likely be able to help you with that as well. So that's really a common cause of export failing when you do have mandatory labels, is simply that in that case the sensitivity label wasn't applied. And then finally, and this is actually one of the examples of export failing. So exporting a report with a protected sensitivity label from the Power BI service to a PBIX file might fail if the size starts to exceed 6 gigabytes. So that is one of the common reasons why export might fail. Now, important to know, so that you can help circumvent that type of failure. Okay, so that's exporting. Let's move on to publishing. Again, when you publish content, you'll have that sensitivity label inheritance. It will automatically apply to the content. However, publishing a protected PBIX file from Power BI Desktop to the Power BI service is not supported for guest users. Even if they have the correct licensing, they have the correct access, if they are a guest user, they will not be able to publish. So it's important that non-guest users are publishing the content. Okay, then we have mandatory labels. So again, your organization, your administrators set up the mandatory labeling requirement in your tenant. So there's really, if you don't have mandatory labels, you can't enable it just for yourself. It's done for most of the time, all users to require labeling of content. If you do have mandatory labeling within your organization, there are a couple of behaviors you'll notice. So as a user, you'll have to apply a label before saving new items in the Power BI service. You'll also have to apply a label before saving changes to an existing unlabeled piece of content in the Power BI service. And users will have to also select a label to apply when they're importing data from an unlabeled PBIX file into the service. So there will be multiple cases where you'll have to go ahead and select the label if you have mandatory labels. And then in Power BI Desktop, it's quite a bit simpler. Users you have to apply labels to unlabeled PBIX files before you can save them or publish them to the service. So with all of those, impacts, this is just ensuring that all of the content within your organization is labeled and therefore protected. Okay, and then the final piece here is label visibility. And you can see a couple of the screenshots. One is from the Power BI desktop, another is from the mobile app. So high level, the label name will show in the Power BI service view, Power BI desktop, embedded reports and dashboards in the Power BI mobile apps. And you'll also see content markings, but there is a caveat where if you remember the Microsoft Purview information protection client that I mentioned way at the beginning of the session, if you do have that client, then the content marking, like a header, footer, or a watermark, will be shown. But if you do not have it, you won't see it. So that's something that you will be able to observe as the end user, but not necessarily control whether the client is deployed or not. Okay, so that was quite a heavy slide. Hopefully the labeling impacts on Power BI are clear. I'd like to then move on to the takeaways of this presentation. So it may feel like you're in a dense forest, not seeing the light with everything that we've gone through based on impacts, based on applying the labels, but high-level takeaways that will help you to see the light and not feel overwhelmed with all of these data protection measures. First is simply start by observing and being curious. Look at your current files. Do they have sensitivity labels applied? Can you remove sensitivity labels? Do this on a test file though, not on actual sensitive data. Test if you have mandatory labeling. Test if you have the Microsoft Purview information protection client. These are all ways that will help you to determine how you can productively work while labeling and protecting your data. Second takeaway, make sure that you understand permissions before applying sensitivity labels with encryption. So you may have noticed a lot of the behavior gotchas that I mentioned had to actually do with encrypting sensitivity labels. So it is important that if you do go ahead and you know that you need to apply a label that is high sensitivity, applies encryption settings, understand how it works, especially if you're the person applying the label, because there will be cases where you'll have to add a user or grant them a certain usage right in order to stay productive in working with Power BI and Excel. And finally, don't be afraid to reach out to your dedicated support team. In saying that, I don't mean reach out to them, every time you have a question about what a label is or how it works. But if you're experiencing issues, that is a verified channel to get support for your issues. Oftentimes, when your organization is rolling out sensitivity labels, you'll have, whether it's a SharePoint site or another type of repository, you'll have a place where there is lots of great educational content, FAQs, change guides, things like that that you can refer to, and that can help, learn and educate you on how to properly use sensitivity labels in your workflow. But in the case where maybe you're facing some access issues, or maybe your export is failing and you just can't figure out why, the support team is always there to help. So those are my 3 takeaways for end users. I'd like to also highlight some takeaways for administrators in case we have some admins watching this call. So the first one is, do not make labeling more complicated than it needs to be. You saw the labeling schema that I used as an example. It had 4 labels: public, internal, confidential, and restricted. There are, of course, cases where you'll need more labels, sub-labels, completely understand. However, complicated labeling makes it more difficult for your end users to adopt the labels, and it also makes it harder on the support teams for debugging issues with labels. So the simpler labeling schema tends to be more effective. Again, with that caveat of different use cases and whatnot, they might warrant an extra label or two, but we have seen great success with that type of 4 labeling schema. The second one here is follow a phased rollout approach. So if your organization currently doesn't have sensitivity labels rolled out and you're just in the process of going ahead, rolling them out, do this step by step. It is hard, honestly, to roll it out to the entire organization and expect that it will not affect the productivity of your users. When you follow a phased rollout approach with different business groups, you get their feedback, you make any edits that need to be made, you create more change management documents, for example, then you can make sure that you're really balancing security and productivity throughout the sensitivity label rollout. So that's the second takeaway. And the third and final takeaway is invest in organizational change management. So make sure your users are aware of any changes coming to sensitivity labels. Make sure that they are well informed as to how sensitivity labels work, what are the impacts that they may have on their day-to-day work, and how do they manage those impacts to stay productive while also protecting their data. So those are my 3 takeaways for administrators. And that brings us to the end of the session. So thank you so much. Again, there's the QR code. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. So pass it back over to Faraz. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much, Anna. It was really lovely, something really different talking about security. As Christian, he mentioned on the YouTube chat, security is a key. So definitely, it's very important in today's world, to know more about security, how you can best secure your data. By the way, there is one question on the chat. Like I think the user is it's an end user. He said that he has a Microsoft 365, uh, and he approaches admin, but unfortunately they are not able to find it out where they can activate the sensitivity label.
Hmm. Okay. So maybe I would recommend to send me a message because this feels like a very specific question to maybe the versioning that you have. It might be the licensing that you have. So there's a couple of factors that would play there. And I'd be interested in digging into specifically what you're seeing. But yeah, so you would need the correct licensing. You would need the correct version of your Office applications to actually be able to apply these sensitivity labels. And your administrators will need to correctly set up the sensitivity labels as well. So, yeah.
Great. And there is another question that can it be available for is it available for the family version of Office? I don't think so. Please
I
correct me.
don't I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
these are typically for like enterprise deployments. We're using E3, E5 licensing, things like that.
Okay. Great, great. I think there are some more questions, but I would definitely, since we are with very limited time, and maybe what you can do is definitely put it on the LinkedIn, and maybe Anna can definitely reply you, or you can just DM on this YouTube chat, and I'll just try to connect Anna on that one and make sure that you get the response and some. And as she has also mentioned, some about key takeaways where you can find learning content, and it's really insightful. Anna, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insight. Now, but before we sign out from the YouTube, Anna, just any last words or anything you would just like to say, any kind of a quote or inspirational thing, something related to data or something related to your special quote you would like that would encourage the community, and also the women tech, because this meetup, what I'm doing in tech, thank you for coming and contributing it on this one, because it is really a great stuff what you're doing along with me, and I really appreciate about that.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think the space you've created for the community to come together and learn is something that is really special. So happy to be a part of it. And of course, as a security person, I would say that my last few words would be around us working together, end users and security folk, to balance the security and productivity. Because this is how we can effectively go forward. And AI is causing lots of security concerns. It's having a huge impact on productivity in a positive and in a negative way. But by working together, we can help balance these security priorities, productivity priorities, and the trade-offs that can occur between the two. So those would be my last couple of closing words. And again, thank you so much for everybody who has tuned in. I hope this session was helpful. It was my first time delivering it, so if you do have feedback, do not hold back. Happy to hear and improve based on what the community has to say. So thank you again.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. So, guys, we are going to sign out from the YouTube, but we are still going to be on Zoom. So just stay back. The party is still there, and we're going to see next month, inshallah, after the Eid. And I wish you again and happy Ramadan, and see you all, guys. See you in the next session in March.